Have you ever been called lucky? That feeling when people dismiss everything you fought for, turning years of sweat and sacrifice into some cheap lottery ticket win? I remember it clearly, the way they laughed, the way they said, Deshawn Mitchell just got lucky. They never saw the nights I fell asleep over spreadsheets, my hand cramped around a broken pen from writing plans until the paper thinned out. They never saw the rejections, the slammed doors, the smirks, all because I was a black man daring to dream bigger than what they thought I deserved. But here's what I learned. Every insult, every bruise can be turned into bricks to build the road forward. They called me lucky. I called it the power of endurance, the pride of silent persistence, the refusal to stay down even when there was no space left for me at the table. And somewhere along the way, my goal shifted. It wasn't about earning a chair in someone else's bright room anymore. I wanted to build the entire room, walls, doors, and all, so no one could ever shut me out again. When success finally knocked, they still called me lucky. I didn't argue, because that dismissive laugh was the same thing that flipped the whole game. While they were busy underestimating me, I had already become the one writing the rules. And today I'm telling this story, not to brag, but to prove one thing. Sometimes what they call luck is just pain, alchemized into a power they can't erase. Hit subscribe, turn on the notifications, share this story, and leave a comment wherever you're listening. Because now we're going back to the very beginning. The first interview where a single smirk was enough to shut the door on my future. But that was also the moment Deshawn Mitchell learned how to flip the board in ways no one saw coming. Back then, I still carried a naive belief that a college degree and a thick portfolio could open any door. My name is Deshawn Mitchell. Fresh out of school, I walked into the company headquarters wearing a cheap rental suit, ironed so crisply you could cut paper on the seams. I clutched my folder of documents, pages filled with proof of years of grinding, top grades, a well-reviewed thesis, glowing letters from professors. In my head, this was the turning point, from an unknown student to someone who finally had a place in the real world. The lobby was bright, marble floors reflecting every passing figure. I remember the sound of my worn shoes scuffing against that polished surface, like they didn't belong there. I held my head high, tried to look confident, though my palms were damp with sweat. I believed people would see my skills, my determination, and invite me to sit down as a serious candidate. The interview room was small, neatly arranged, with a pitcher of water on the table as if to test how dry your throat would get. Mr. Carter, the hiring manager, sat across from me. He skimmed my resume, then looked up, eyes flat, like someone staring at a painting they didn't ask to see. I spoke about my internships, the projects I'd worked on, my ambition to contribute to the company's growth. Every word carried my last ounce of hope, like a soldier firing his final arrow. He nodded, but not the kind of nod that says he's impressed. It was the automatic nod of someone hearing background music in a cafe. I barely had time to exhale before he closed the folder with a sharp click. Then came the words, quiet but heavy enough to slam against my chest. We're looking for someone who fits our company culture. Culture. Just two syllables, yet they rose like a wall. I understood instantly. This culture wasn't in any HR handbook. It was in skin tones, in accents, in unspoken codes no one dared to write down. I sat there for a few seconds, forced a smile, but inside I heard something crack. I walked out trying to keep my steps steady. I didn't know this was only the first of many doors about to slam in my face, but even then, I realized confidence alone wasn't enough. I would need something else, something that would make their laughter choke in their throats. He had looked me over once more from my hair down to my shoes. That gaze wasn't measuring skill, it was measuring how well I matched the picture in his head. Then came that thin smile, like I'd just told a cute story he'd already forgotten. We need someone who fits the culture, he repeated. 7 words, heavy as a gavel hitting the bench. I forced another smile. Culture. The word echoed in my head, clanging like iron on iron. I wanted to ask, which culture? The culture of hard work, of good grades, or the culture of trendy suits, light skin, easy smiles? He didn't explain. Just flipped to the last page of my resume and closed it again with another dry click. It felt like a cell door locking shut. I wasn't a candidate being considered. I was a defendant, and the verdict had been written by us long before I entered the room. "You have an impressive record," he added, "but we believe the team needs someone more fitting." I knew right then I was out. Not for lack of skills or achievements, but because I didn't carry the version of fitting they had in mind. I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass wall. The rental suit, the scuffed shoes, the dark skin under those bright office lights. I realized I could change the suit. But there was one thing I could never change. And to them, that was reason enough to close the door. A dozen comebacks raced through my mind. I wanted to slam my hand on the table, ask him how culture could have a color. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, nodded, stood up. His eyes had already moved on, his hand reaching for the next resume. I left without a handshake, without a promise of a call. The door shut behind me, leaving only the echo of that word, culture. It no longer sounded like the idealistic concept from textbooks. It had become the key they used to lock my future on the very first step. And I told myself, if today they used culture to shut me out, one day I'd turn that same word into evidence of the narrowness they refused to admit. I stepped into the hallway, my shoes tapping softly against the floor, each sound a small reminder that I had just lost my very first battle. The cold fluorescent light spilling from the interview room stayed behind me, as if to underline the fact that it wasn't meant for me. I drew in a long breath, forcing down the bitterness rising in my throat. But just as I was about to leave, the door swung open and a familiar face walked in. Ethan Wallace. I recognized him instantly. We'd sat in the same business strategy class. His name dragged back a sour memory. That morning when I had presented my carefully crafted research paper, only to watch him read almost the exact same words the next day and receive thunderous applause. I had sat in the back row, fists clenched under the desk, unable to say a thing. And now here he was, stepping into the very room that had just shut me out. Through the glass, I saw him shake hands with Mr. Carter. They smiled at each other, just the right mix of formal and friendly, like actors in a play they'd rehearsed in advance. Ethan sat down with the easy comfort of someone who already belonged there. In my head, the words slammed one by one. He will get it. Not because he's better than me, because he fits. A sharp pain ran down my spine. I realized then, in their eyes, my intelligence would never be enough to open the door. But if the same intelligence came wrapped in a different color, suddenly it became a prized asset. The label lucky they would one day throw at me. Maybe it was really them who lived off the luck of invisible privilege. I stood there for a few seconds, watching the scene like it was some bitter comedy. Then I turned away. My footsteps were neither fast nor slow, but in my head a question pounded heavy as stone. How many times will my mind be left outside the door just because of my skin? I didn't have the answer then. I only knew this. Every door that slammed shut carved another crack inside me. And from those cracks I would build my own road, a road no one could laugh at, no one could lock. So if they thought I would disappear after one rejection, they were wrong. I wouldn't disappear. I was quietly preparing to flip the entire board. I remember that day vividly, the lecture hall packed to the brim, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, glinting off the long rows of desks where students squeezed in shoulder to shoulder. The air buzzed with chatter, eager and restless, like a marketplace of ideas. The professor had announced each student would have 5 minutes to pitch a startup idea, and the most convincing one would advance to the university competition. Sitting in the waiting row, I clutched my stack of notes, my heart pounding like a war drum. A dozen questions echoed in my mind. Was my idea different enough? Would they laugh at me? But woven through the nerves was a thin thread of belief. This wasn't just an assignment. This was the dream I had been nurturing for years. A small tech platform to give mom-and-pop stores a fair chance against corporate giants, so the market wouldn't belong only to those with the deepest pockets. When the professor called my name, my legs felt bolted to the floor, but somehow they carried me forward. I walked to the front, the murmurs fading behind me. I caught sight of Ethan Wallace in the front row, his eyes narrowed like he was already bored, but I ignored him. I took a breath, then began to speak. The words came easier than I expected. I painted a picture of tiny shops standing tall beside sprawling supermarkets. of a marketplace where value, not wealth, was what mattered. I saw some students nodding, a few scribbling notes. Even the professor's brows lifted slightly, a flicker of interest in his eyes. 5 minutes disappeared in a heartbeat. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then a few rounds of applause rippled through the air. Not thunderous, but enough to warm my chest. For the first time, I felt like my voice carried weight. That my idea could be heard. I left the podium with my hands still trembling, but it was excitement, not fear, that made them shake. In that moment, I naively believed a door had cracked open. I didn't yet know that the very idea I had poured my heart into would be snatched away in front of the entire class the very next day. And the thief would be none other than the man in the front row, Ethan Wallace, with the easy smile of someone born for betrayal. The next morning, I walked into the lecture hall lighter than I had in months, the memory of nodding heads and polite applause still clinging to me like a second skin. I sat in the middle rows listening as group after group presented. Most were pitching dating apps or recycled e-commerce models. I started to feel quietly confident, at least my idea had been original. Then came Ethan Wallace's turn. He rose from his seat like a man stepping onto a TED Talk stage, buttoning his jacket with the poise of someone about to sign $1 million deal. He smiled at the professor, at the class, and then the words fell from his mouth one by one and my blood ran cold. It was my idea, word for word. He spoke of small shops being swallowed by corporations, of a platform to balance the playing field, of a market where opportunity was equal. The same examples, the same phrasing, the same rhythm in his voice that I had carried with shaking hands the day before. I sat there frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears, not from excitement this time, but from rage. The professor nodded along, eyes bright with the same interest he'd shown yesterday. Only this time, the applause was thunderous, the whistles sharp, the admiration unmistakable. Ethan stood there, soaking it in, the self-satisfied grin of a man stealing in broad daylight without fear of consequence. And me? I was a ghost in the very room where I had been alive just yesterday. I wanted to stand up, to shout, that was mine, but my throat locked. Because I knew how it would look. The bitter loser versus the golden boy. And Ethan, with his polished shoes and pale skin and practiced charm, would always be the golden boy. I scanned the room. No one was looking at me. A few even turned to nod at Ethan as if he were some visionary. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't just lost credit for an idea. I had lost the right to even claim it was mine. As the applause crashed like waves, I sat gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles burned. My silence felt like swallowing glass. And in my head, a single question echoed. How many times will my mind be erased while someone else wears my voice like a mask? Ethan's presentation ended in a storm of applause. I sat there, my heart hammering like a drum, my head crammed with words that wouldn't come out. The professor walked over, shook Ethan's hand, and gave him the smile I had craved just the day before. Ethan bowed slightly, the star of the show, before strolling back to his front row seat. As he passed my desk, he stopped. His eyes flicked over the folder lying in front of me, then back to my face, wearing a smirk that cut deeper than a blade. "Lucky you, Deshawn, getting to study alongside me," he said casually, like it was nothing. But the words twisted like a knife. I froze, a stiff smile stretching across my face, pretending not to hear. But inside, that sentence rang like mockery in an empty hall. He hadn't just stolen my idea. He had turned the truth into a joke, turned me into the side character in a story I had written with my own hands. The class chuckled softly, not because they knew what happened, but because they believed the role he had crafted for himself. Ethan, the brilliant, witty, talented golden boy. And me? Deshawn Mitchell? My name dissolved under their laughter like it had never belonged to me at all. I swallowed hard, choosing silence. In that moment, I learned something bitter. In this world, the truth doesn't always speak the loudest. Sometimes the one who lies boldly, shamelessly, becomes the one people believe. And the one who stays silent, even when right, gets pushed aside like they were never there. But I also learned something else. His smug words, the class's laughter, the professor's handshake, none of it was the final chapter. They were just notches carved into my memory, a ledger of debts I would one day collect page by page. He thought I was lucky to study alongside him. I smiled faintly, but inside I told myself, no, the luck was his. Luck to bask in a spotlight that wasn't his to begin with. And borrowed light always burns out. The question lingered in my mind. How many more times would ideas like mine be stolen, paraded around in someone else's name, before the silence caught fire and burned these cheap performances to the ground? I still remember that morning. Clear skies, a light breeze. But inside me, it felt like war drums were pounding. I carried a cheap briefcase. Inside it, the business plan I had spent months preparing. My shirt was old. Its color faded from too many washes, but I had ironed it carefully the night before. I told myself, the clothes may be worn, but the idea must be fresh. The shoes may be scuffed, but the road I was about to walk had to be wide. The bank building towered ahead, tall and cold, its glass walls gleaming like mirrors. I caught my reflection, a lean figure, eyes shadowed from too many late nights drafting projections, but in my hands was hope. I walked in convinced that if I presented my plan clearly enough, they would see the value. Numbers don't lie, I told myself. True ambition cannot be denied. The bank's lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and spotless furniture, employees dressed in crisp uniforms. I felt like I'd stepped onto a stage where every move was under scrutiny. I sat in the waiting area, carefully opened my briefcase, and reviewed my charts, revenue forecasts, and growth plans one last time. I believed this was my ticket out of the shadows into the light. 3 hours crawled by. I stayed in that chair, my back stiff, eyes locked on the electronic board displaying numbers that never seemed to call my name. Each time an employee smiled and ushered someone else inside, I straightened my tie, thinking my turn had come. It hadn't. People arriving after me were taken in first, one after another. I sat there swallowing my impatience, telling myself maybe my file required more careful review. When they finally called me, I rose with the most composed posture I could manage. Walking through that office door felt like stepping into the most important moment of my life. In my hands wasn't just a business plan. It was the belief that after so many doors had slammed in my face, this time one would finally open. I didn't know yet that this door wouldn't open at all, that it was about to shut on me harder than any before. And the lesson wouldn't be about business alone, but about the invisible weight people carry into rooms like this, heavier than any number on any page. The woman across the desk introduced herself as Mrs. Hargrove. Dark blue suit, silver-rimmed glasses, every movement precise, the kind of person who read numbers but not people. I handed over my business plan, my hand trembling, not with fear but with anticipation. She flipped through the first pages. I waited for her eyes to stop, to ask questions, to look at me as someone worth investing in. But her gaze skimmed the paper like someone glancing at a flyer handed out on the street. First page, second page, third. I opened my mouth to explain the revenue streams, the pilot testing I'd done, but before I could speak, she closed the folder with a sharp snap. Not safe. 2 words dropped on the table like a judge's gavel. I blinked, thinking I'd misheard. I waited for an explanation, a note in the margins, some feedback on the projections. But no. She pushed the folder back toward me. The gesture was calm but absolute, like the conversation had ended before it began. "Ma'am," I stammered, "this model's already been tested with small clients and—" She cut me off, her voice level, neither harsh nor soft, but cold enough to freeze the air. "The bank requires security. Your idea doesn't." I sat straighter, swallowing the weight in my chest. 3 hours of waiting, all the times I had fixed my tie, every nod of reassurance I'd given myself, all for 2 words that slammed down like a verdict, passed without trial. I caught my reflection in the polished desk. A young man, cheap shirt, eyes dimming under the fluorescent lights. In that moment, I realized failure doesn't always come because the numbers aren't right. Sometimes failure comes because the moment you walk in, they've already decided that no number attached to you will ever be enough. I closed the folder, holding it tight against my chest, forcing a thin smile to hide the blade twisting inside me. I stood, nodded, and walked out. Behind me, her voice called for the next client. Soft, polite, but to me, it sounded like the slam of a door locking shut. I walked out of that office, the door closing behind me with a small click that felt heavier than any slammed door. I took a long, steady breath, trying to convince myself this setback was only temporary. The business plan was still in my hands, intact, but suddenly it felt like a block of stone tied to my chest. As I passed through the hallway, I stopped for a moment. Through the glass wall, I saw Mrs. Hargrove still sitting at her desk. The only difference now was the person in front of her, a young white man, neatly combed hair, light blue shirt pressed to perfection. On the table, I recognized a few familiar pages, revenue charts, a business model eerily similar to the one I had just presented. But this time, her expression was different. Gone was the cold detachment. She leaned forward slightly, a warm smile on her lips, eyes lighting up as if she had just discovered a hidden gem. She nodded along, even jotting down notes every so often. The sight made the blood in my veins run hot. I stood frozen, fingers gripping the handle of my briefcase so hard it hurt. Just minutes ago, I had been dismissed with 2 words: not safe. And now the same idea, dressed in a different skin tone, was suddenly a promising opportunity. The contrast hit me like a slap across the face. I asked myself, was I really short on capital? Or was I simply missing the color of skin they considered acceptable? The question cut through my mind like a blade, melting away whatever naive faith I still carried. I turned away, walking faster so no one would see the fire burning in my eyes. But deep inside, something had taken root. There were doors that would never open for me, no matter how many numbers I brought, no matter how many plans I built. If I wanted to walk in, I would have to build my own door. My footsteps echoed against the marble floor, each strike a reminder. Today's rejection wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much bigger fight. And I wondered, not just for myself, but for everyone like me, how many more times would we have to watch our ideas stolen, our work erased, simply because it didn't come in a body they approved of? I had saved for 3 months just to buy that ticket. The biggest startup conference of the year, a place where investors, mentors, and the brightest faces in entrepreneurship all gathered. The ticket cost more than a month's rent, but I believed being there meant a door would finally open. In my imagination, I already saw myself standing in the grand hall, shaking hands with powerful people, exchanging business cards, hearing someone say, "This idea is worth investing in." The night before, I couldn't sleep. I laid out my best suit on the bed, polished my shoes until the lights reflected off them. I practiced my short introduction over and over, smooth and confident, so that if I met the right person, I wouldn't waste the chance. That night, I was both excited and anxious, like a kid before a big exam, except this time, the test was my entire life. The next morning, I arrived at the convention center early. The building rose high, its glass walls reflecting the sky. From the entrance, I saw clusters of well-dressed people laughing, shaking hands firmly, exchanging greetings like old friends. The air was thick with confidence, almost celebratory. I gripped my briefcase tighter and walked among them, head held high, telling myself I belonged here too. When I received my attendee badge, I held it like it was a passport to another world. Printed clearly on it was my name, Deshawn Mitchell, with the words "full access" gleaming under the lights. I stared at it for a moment, wanting to carve this milestone into memory. Stepping into the main lobby, I was momentarily overwhelmed. Chandeliers blazed overhead. A massive LED screen flashed the words, "Welcome Innovators." Exhibition booths lined the walls. Soft music floated through the air, mingling with laughter and the clinking of glasses. I imagined myself walking up to a famous investor, offering my hand, hearing them praise the idea I had poured my life into. In my mind, this was the beginning of everything. What I didn't know was that the badge with "full access" printed on it was about to become a worthless piece of paper. And while I dreamed of standing under the bright lights, someone had already decided I belonged in the hallway, the one lit by cold fluorescent bulbs. I walked toward the doors leading into the grand hall where golden light spilled out, where laughter and applause rolled through like music from another world. I held up my badge, ready to step inside when a security guard raised his hand to stop me. "You'll have to stay in the networking area out in the hallway," he said, voice flat, like he'd repeated the line 100 times already. I blinked, confused, holding the badge closer. "It says full access right here," I replied, keeping my tone steady. He barely glanced at it, then shrugged. "Yeah, but the main hall's for special guests only. Your section is out there." I looked down at the badge in my hand. The words were printed clearly. The holographic seal gleamed. Yet in that moment, it might as well have been a blank slip of paper, official but meaningless. I swallowed hard, feeling every ounce of expectation sink straight into the pit of my stomach. Behind me, groups of people walked in easily, smiling, flashing their badges, never stopped, never questioned. I recognized some of them, people who hadn't paid half of what I saved for months to afford. Yet they were welcomed with warm handshakes and nods. I stood there as the stream of attendees flowed past, feeling like a nameless obstacle in their way. For a moment, I wanted to argue, to demand answers, to ask for the organizers. But then I saw the guard's eyes, cold, bored, used to this scene, and realized it wouldn't matter. I stepped back, watching the doors slowly swing shut. Inside, the chandeliers glowed over white tablecloths and crystal glasses. The music floated through, joined by the steady clink of champagne flutes, a celebration of the chosen ones. And me? I turned back toward the hallway, where the flickering fluorescent lights hummed over rows of plastic chairs hastily arranged for the networking area. The badge in my hand was still intact. But now I understood. Its value wasn't in the price I paid for it, but in the skin tone and the name of the one who carried it. I sat down on one of the cold chairs, surrounded by others who had been kept outside like me. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. Maybe, I thought, the real stories tonight wouldn't be told under the chandeliers, but out here, in the hallway. I sat in the cold hallway, the fluorescent lights above washing every face pale as wax. Plastic chairs lined the wall, a few people hunched over their phones, nobody bothering to speak. The air here felt nothing like the main hall, where laughter and warm music kept spilling out like a parallel universe. I rested the folder on my lap, fingers tapping unconsciously against the cover. A heavy mix of humiliation and emptiness welled up inside me. I wondered if I had been foolish to believe that buying a ticket meant I had earned the right to step into that arena. Then, a voice beside me. "You look different from the rest." I looked up. A middle-aged man, dressed far more simply than most of the people I'd seen today, was watching me. His eyes held no judgment, no condescension, just a kind of genuine curiosity. "Why do you say that?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He shrugged. "Everyone out there is busy showing off, but you're sitting here holding that folder like it's something worth protecting. Makes me think you've got a story to tell." His words made my pulse quicken. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the folder and began to share. It wasn't a polished pitch. No stage lights, no shiny microphones. Just me, him, and pages smudged with ink. But this time no one cut me off. Every idea I spoke was heard in full. He nodded several times, his eyes gradually brightening. When I finished, he held out his hand. "I run a chain of small stores," he said. "What you just described? It's exactly what we need." I shook his hand, a strange rush of emotion filling me. Out here, where the organizers had shoved me aside like a second-class guest, I had just found my very first customer. When he left, I looked down at the full access badge still clipped to my pocket. I let out a small laugh, half bitter, half proud. Sometimes, getting shut out of the main door forces you to find your own entrance. And maybe this cold, fluorescent hallway was where my real journey began. But I also knew, if tonight the hallway gave me a chance, tomorrow another door could still slam shut in my face. And the question still hung heavy in the air. How far would I have to go before people finally saw my true worth? The day my company landed its very first customer, I sat in silence for a long time in that cramped little room that doubled as both office and storage closet. The contract lay on the desk, signature ink still glistening blue. It wasn't some grand victory, but to me, it was proof. After all the doors slammed in my face, someone had finally chosen to walk through and believe in me. The news spread faster than I expected. A few weeks later, a local newspaper called, inviting me for an interview. The reporter said they were curious about this story of starting from nothing. I agreed immediately, even though I knew deep down the company was still nothing more than a speck of dust on the map. But to me, it was a chance to speak louder, to prove I wasn't just some shadow standing in the hallway anymore. On the day of the interview, I wore the same old suit, the one that had followed me through every failed job interview, but this time I wore it differently. I wasn't there to beg for a chance. I was there to talk about a chance I had created myself. On the way to the studio, my heart pounded as I rehearsed the things I wanted to say. About perseverance, about the dream of fairness, about refusing to quit even when every door had slammed shut. Under the studio lights, I squinted a little, but inside I felt solid. The host asked about the struggles, about how I survived with no funding, no connections. I answered with nothing but honesty, no embellishment, no pretty words, just raw truth. I saw them nodding, saw the camera lens almost encouraging me to keep going. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it. My story was finally being heard. Maybe I would no longer be the outsider looking in. I thought a small victory like this might erase some of the doubt people had piled on me. But I didn't know yet. Right after that interview aired, the whispers would start. Little chuckles dismissing me as someone who just got lucky. And once again, the contempt wore a polite smile, eager to wipe away the sweat, the hunger, the sleepless nights behind my work. After the interview, my company's name started appearing here and there in minor news segments. The phone rang more often. A few partnership offers came through. I thought maybe, finally, after all the hallways I had been shoved into, I was about to sit at a real table. Then came the meeting with the investor who dragged me right back down to earth, even lower than where I had started. His name was Mr. Langford. Salt and pepper hair, tailored pinstripe suit, a smirk that suggested the whole world bored him. I remember preparing meticulously for that meeting, carrying every report, every scrap of proof of our first customer. I spoke about the sleepless nights, about being shut out of the main halls, about clawing my way to that first contract. I spoke with conviction, believing this time someone would see the weight of persistence. He listened, or at least he looked like he did, eyes scanning the pages, occasionally raising a brow, but never for more than a breath. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, smirked in that typical shirt, and said, looks like you're just a lucky boy. Right place, right time. I went quiet. Lucky. The word didn't fall like a compliment. It landed like a dismissal. All the sweat, the hunger, the nights spent grinding through spreadsheets wiped away with one word. He didn't see the endurance, the fight. He saw a young black man who had just scratched a winning lottery ticket. I gave a thin smile. Tell me, sir, did luck write this business plan for me? He didn't answer directly, just shrugged. In business, timing often matters more than effort. Then he closed the folder, the same way Mrs. Hargrove had at the bank. I sat there, letting his words hit, feeling them soak through like rain on raw skin. To men like him, my work was a gust of wind. He didn't see the blood behind it. He didn't care to. To him, I was a symbol of randomness, not a man who had fought his way through 100 slammed doors. When I left that office, I felt half amused, half furious. They called me lucky, but luck had never paid my rent, never pulled me through those nights with nothing but coffee and spreadsheets, and in my head, a thought rose, sharp and defiant. If this is what they call luck, what will they call it when this so-called luck flips the whole table over? The next morning, I bought the local paper, like I always did. Right on the front page of the business section, there he was. Mr. Langford, that same faint smirk on his face, as if the whole world had gathered just to hear him talk. I flipped the page quickly, not bracing myself for what I was about to see, and there it was, in bold letters. Deshawn Mitchell, he's just a lucky boy, right place, right time. Mr. Langford. For a few seconds, I just sat there frozen. They had printed the entire quote. No edits, no softening. Every word carved into paper like a blade put on display for everyone to see. I felt the heat rush to my face, part shame, part fury. Overnight, I had been turned into a public punchline, branded as the lucky one for strangers to laugh at. But as my eyes moved down the page, something unexpected appeared. The article didn't stop at his insult. Right below it, they laid out my product in detail. analyzed why small businesses were already embracing it, and highlighted its potential if scaled further. My name appeared again and again, not as a footnote, but as the centerpiece of a story that refused to vanish. Readers could sneer at Langford's comment if they wanted, but they would remember the name attached to it. And ironically, his condescension had just turned into the loudest advertisement I could have asked for. I read every line, the bitterness in my chest, twisting into a thin smile. Some people try to bury you, not realizing they're handing you the spotlight while they do it. By that afternoon, my inbox was flooded. A few smaller reporters wanted follow-up interviews. Potential customers reached out, curious about the service. No one cared about how much Langford had dismissed me. What they remembered was that a major investor had publicly mentioned a new product. My product. I folded the paper and set it on my tiny desk, whispering, "Thank you, Mr. Langford." But I also knew the spotlight wasn't built to last. It could vanish tomorrow unless I grabbed it and set my own fire burning. And the question kept circling in my head. How many more times would they use mockery to erase my work, only to watch it backfire and build the very platform they wanted to deny me? The heavy wooden door shut behind me, revealing a conference room carpeted thick and silent, the yellow light spilling over a long table lined with faces I'd only ever seen in glossy business magazines. It was my first time entering a boardroom as the CEO of my own company. On paper, I belonged there, but the way they looked at me said otherwise, as if I were an uninvited guest who had wandered into a banquet reserved for those who'd inherited power for generations. Each chair around the table was a fortress. The tailored suits, the polished watches, the thin, practiced smiles, they all seemed to converge on me at once. I walked slowly to my seat, the sound of my shoes against the carpet echoing like an intruder's footsteps. Inside, I told myself to keep my head up, shoulders squared. I knew the moment I slouched, they'd take it as proof I didn't belong. But the hardest thing to hide was the weight of the silence when I sat down. No greetings, no nods of acknowledgement, just eyes watching, waiting for me to miss a step so they could jot another mark in their invisible ledger. He's just a fluke. He won't last. A server poured water. The glass in front of me rippled under the light. Across the table, I saw Mr. Douglas, a veteran in the industry, the kind whose opinion decided fates. He leaned back, fingers laced over his stomach, eyes narrowing like he was observing a minor inconvenience. I tried to listen, to take notes as they discussed market projections, but my presence was an off-key note in their symphony. The chair beneath me was supposed to mean I had standing here, but at that moment it felt borrowed, like it could be yanked away at any second. I breathed slowly, reminding myself, their silence wasn't a verdict, just a dare. No one was going to hand me permanence in this room. If I wanted to keep this seat, I'd have to prove it was mine. And that taking it from me would cost them more than they could afford. The meeting began with numbers, charts glowing on the big screen. I stayed focused, waiting for my turn. Every point I'd planned was lined up in my head, sharp and ready. I believed preparation would force them to see me as an equal. But when I finally opened my mouth, Mr. Douglas raised his hand, a small gesture, but it sliced through the air like a blade. He leaned back, elbow on the armrest, voice flat and dismissive. "Don't fool yourself, you just got lucky." That was it, no elaboration, no debate. And then the quiet laughter started. Thin, restrained, spreading around the table like a slow infection. Not loud enough to break decorum, but sharp enough to sting. A theater of contempt. I sat up straighter, eyes forward. The sound looped in my head, scraping like metal against glass. This wasn't just a remark, it was a sentence. Their message was clear. My presence here was an accident, a temporary glitch, and they were certain I'd vanish soon enough, leaving the room to its rightful owners. I caught the eyes of others around the table. Some leaned back with faint smirks, enjoying the show. Others looked down at their papers, pretending busyness, but their silence hit harder than the laughter. No one objected. They let the words hang there, a knife pinned to the wall above my head. I bit the inside of my cheek, the metallic taste of blood spreading on my tongue. Part of me wanted to fire back, to talk about the nights I went without sleep, the first client I signed, the countless ways I'd kept this company alive when it was hanging by a thread. But I knew better. A rebuttal here would be a pebble tossed into their ocean of smirks. It would sink without a ripple. So I stayed still, hands resting calmly on the table. And in that silence, a question flared in my mind, hot and steady. Why is my perseverance called luck, while their inherited privilege is called merit? The question sat there, smoldering, waiting for its moment to burn the whole script down. As the chuckle still rippled faintly around the table, the screen at the front of the room suddenly lit up. No introductions, no explanations. Just numbers. Charts bending upward. Revenue bars rising higher than forecast. Profits slicing past every early projection like a blade through paper. Cold, clean data filling the room with a truth no one had asked for, but now couldn't escape. The laughter thinned out, slowing like a river losing its current. I stayed silent. Didn't cut in, didn't rush to claim victory. The overhead lights gleamed off the screen, throwing each line, each percentage point back onto their faces. A few glances darted sideways, brief, uneasy. Mr. Douglas still leaned back in his chair, but now his fingers tapped a slow, irregular beat on the armrest, a small tell, the only crack in his composure. I could feel the air shifting, mockery curdling into something heavier. They couldn't laugh with those numbers staring them down, couldn't sneer when the data itself was the one speaking. And me? I just sat there, spine straight, eyes on the screen, letting the silence sharpen itself into a weapon. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt for years, forced to face reality with nothing left to say in defense. Numbers didn't care about skin color. They didn't respect privilege. They just told the truth. And the truth tonight was on my side. Someone on the board cleared their throat, a small attempt to break the tension, but no one followed. Another shuffled his papers too quickly, sending a pen clattering onto the table, a loud, awkward punctuation mark in the thick quiet. I stayed silent. I didn't need to add a single word. The quiet hit harder than any speech I could give. And in that moment, I knew I'd flip the board over. Not by arguing, not by pleading, but by letting the truth reveal itself. But walking out of that boardroom later, I felt no relief. I knew better. A report might shut them up for one meeting, but prejudice didn't die that easily. It just lay still, waiting, patient, ready for the next chance to bite. The question stayed with me as I left. How many more times would I have to let the numbers defend my right to exist? And how many more times would silence have to speak for me? The office door swung open, and the face that stepped in dragged the past behind it like a cold wind cutting across my back. Ethan Wallace. Still the same familiar smile. Only now the corners of his mouth were stretched too thin, none of the glittering smugness left from the day the whole class cheered his name. I saw the fatigue carved into his face, the crooked tie that failed to hide the posture of a man stumbling in his own shoes. He walked forward, hand extended. "Deshawn," he said, voice syrupy, as if the years hadn't left jagged scars between us. "We should work together, like the old days." I didn't take his hand. My eyes stayed on it. The same hand that once slammed the podium to claim my idea as his. The same hand that signed projects rooted in my sweat and sleepless nights. Now it reached toward me like a drowning man's lifeline. I leaned back in my chair, silent. Inside my head, the words "the old days" echoed like a nail tapping glass, dragging me back to the memory of him walking past me with that smirk, tossing out the line, "Good thing Deshawn got to learn alongside me." The memory was still hot, as if it had happened yesterday. And now here he stood, with pleading eyes glazed in sugar. But I could see through the sweetness, down to the hollow core of desperation. His world had spun the other way, and now he was standing at the door of a room he never believed I'd set foot in. I smiled faintly, said nothing. It wasn't the smile of a man gloating. It was the smile of someone who had finally learned life's cruel joke. Some hands only reach out when the water is at their chin. The silence stretched, long and deliberate. Every second I let pass was a reminder to him. I hadn't forgotten. I didn't need to answer yet. Sometimes silence is the mirror that makes people watch themselves squirm. When Ethan said "the old days," something in me flinched. For him, those words were nothing more than a friendly bridge, a fake nostalgia draped over years of betrayal. But for me, the old days was a scar. And in my head, the scene replayed like film spooled too tight. Me gripping the edge of the desk, watching him on stage delivering my idea word for word. The examples, the phrasing, even the pauses for effect. Stolen whole. And, oh my, the applause, loud and shameless, pouring over him like sunlight. The professor nodding. Classmates cheering. Someone whistled. And me, sitting there, erased from my own creation, watching him soak in the spotlight that should have burned on my shoulders. On his way back to his seat, he tossed that knife of a line. Good thing Deshawn got to learn alongside me. I remember the heat in my chest, the weight in my throat. And now here he was, in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the cracks, extending that same hand, his voice sugared over with desperation. I heard the old days again, and I almost laughed. Because his old days had been borrowed glory. Mine had been silence and humiliation. I looked at him, calm on the surface, waves breaking underneath. I remembered the feeling of being erased. I remembered the spotlight that never touched me. And now the same man who stole it stood here asking for a handshake. The irony of it all was so sharp, so perfect, I didn't need words to taste it. He called it the old days. But today, standing in my office, he was finally learning how it feels when the lights go out. I let Ethan's hand hang there in the air for a long moment, as if testing how long he could keep it up. Behind the practiced smile on his face, I caught the flicker of unease. Then I reached out and shook it, firm, brief. Just enough for him to think old grudges were buried, enough for him to breathe out in relief. All right, I said, calm, even. We'll talk about working together. His shoulders loosened. That grin bloomed back across his face like a man hearing his sentence had been overturned. He sat down, talking fast. About half-finished projects, debts piling high, the empire of his slipping through his fingers. He talked about us, about turning things around together. I nodded when he expected it, jotted notes in a pad, even smiled a little. He never knew that every nod I gave was like signing off on the next act of a play where he, not I, was the punchline. That night, under the glow of my desk lamp, I signed an exclusive contract with his biggest competitor. A thick stack of papers, ending with a red stamp, hammered down like the final drum beat before the curtain falls. One signature. That was all it took to flip the board. The man who once stood on a lecture stage, stealing my idea for his applause, had held out his hand for rescue. And while his handshake was still warm, I was already pulling the floor out from under him. I didn't feel cruel. I didn't feel triumphant either. I felt balance. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with a quiet, merciless smile carved deeper than any verdict. The next morning, as news of the contract spread, I wondered what he thought when he realized that I, the man he once called lucky, had turned the old days into a stage play he couldn't escape from. And I wondered how many more would learn the same lesson, that what they called my luck was only the overture to a checkmate they never saw coming. I sat in my office, the city lights outside stretching across the horizon like a man-made galaxy. Skyscrapers blazed against the night sky, reflected in the tall glass window in front of me. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were using the product I once coded on a beat-up old laptop in a cramped room. What started as an idea mocked by many had become essential, saving my company and forcing giants to rethink how they operated. The CEO chair beneath me was steady, but it didn't feel like a triumphant throne. It felt like a pause point, a breath taken after a long road full of cuts that never truly healed. Each glowing light out there reminded me of a rejection, of being called lucky, of being pushed into the hallway instead of being let through the door. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. A new revenue report. The numbers shattered every projection. I stared at it, feeling a quiet pride ripple through me. No fireworks, no applause, just cold, undeniable proof that the dream I defended now stood as reality no one could erase. I remembered the day I walked into that bank in my faded shirt, turned away with 2 words, not safe. I remembered the conference where they blocked me at the door, leaving me outside under fluorescent lights while champagne flowed inside. I remembered the classroom laughter when my idea got applause under someone else's name, Those memories never disappeared. They clung to me like the foundation under everything I built. Out there, cars streamed like blood through the city's veins. I wondered how many lives now relied on my product to keep their jobs, to hold on to their dreams. The thought settled over me like calm water. Leaning back in my chair, fingers laced together, I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The city itself was my answer. Sometimes silence weighs more than any defense ever could. The irony wasn't in the revenue charts or the user numbers. It was in the faces of people who once sneered. The ones who called me lucky, who shut the door, who stamped "not safe" on my plans, now depending on my system to keep their companies alive. I saw their names on the client lists. Month after month, they paid for the very platform they once dismissed. Internal reports even called it mission critical. Yet at events, I still overheard the whispers. He just got lucky. Right place, right time. Of course. Lucky was always the easiest way to erase a black man's sweat and blood. It was the clean white cloth they used to cover their own mistakes, so they'd never have to admit they'd been wrong. That they had once mocked what they now couldn't live without. At one party, I ran into Mr. Carter, the same man who first told me I wasn't a cultural fit. He held his wine glass like a prop, smile perfectly staged, and told a circle of guests, "Deshawn Mitchell sure is lucky. Who would have thought he'd make it this far?" I was standing close enough to hear every word. Not one mention of the work. Not one acknowledgement that he once closed the door in my face. I just smiled, set my own glass down, and walked away. My silence turned his sentence into a punchline aimed squarely at him. I stopped expecting recognition from people like that a long time ago. Recognition means admitting they were wrong, and that truth was too heavy for them to swallow. They chose lucky instead, a harmless label for something they couldn't control. I looked out at the city again, thought about the thousands using my platform. If this was luck, then luck was paying their salaries, keeping their companies alive. Maybe fate was laughing at them, forcing them to depend on what they once despised. Still, a question hung in me. When would the truth grow big enough that no one dared call survival itself luck? In those rooms full of polite laughter, I still heard it. Lucky boy. It hovered like a mosquito buzz, not fatal, just irritating enough to notice. I used to want to fight back, to shout, to set the record straight. But I learned something. The more you argue, the more they cling to the word luck, turning your work into a feeble defense. So I stopped arguing. I smiled, I nodded, I stayed quiet. Silence can't be twisted. It can't be misquoted. Silence is a mirror, reflecting the shallowness of their words right back at them. I sat there, city lights burning around me, thinking, if this entire skyline runs on what I built, then who's really lucky? Me for surviving, or them for living off what they once dismissed? My silence wasn't surrender. It was a verdict. Because when the same system that blocked me now needs me to survive, I don't have to shout to prove the obvious. A reporter once asked me, "Do you want to prove the doubters wrong?" I smiled and said, "No, they've already done that for me." He froze, not expecting that answer. But it was the truth. Every time they use my service, every time they pay for what they mocked, they write my defense for me. I know the label lucky will keep circling. It's the easiest way for them to keep feeling superior. But I also know this. The more they say it, the more proof piles up that I outlasted them. That I turned the word into a monument they can't tear down. So I sat there in the glow of the city, letting my silence speak. And inside me, the question kept echoing. How many more times will black people be called lucky? And how many times will we turn that word into proof of our strength? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.